Before the last emperor fell, before the barbarian armies crossed Rome's gates, the seeds of destruction had already been sown. Rome's collapse wasn't a single night of fire and ruin. It was a slow, merciless unraveling, fueled by greed, betrayal, and enemies the empire could have stopped, but didn't. This is not the story you learned in school. This is the hidden truth, the real story of how the greatest empire in history destroyed itself from within. This is the tragic story of power ruin. Rome, not the quiet remnants you walk through today, but a thriving, vibrant civilization at its height. Colossal marble temples gleamed in the sunlight, their towering pillars stretching upward as if to touch the heavens. The streets echoed with the calls of merchants offering goods from distant lands, fragrant spices from Arabia, fine silk from China, and rich wines from the hills of Gaul. Senators in immaculate white garments trimmed with deep purple walked purposefully through the forum, engaged in debates over laws that could influence territories far beyond the city. The rhythmic clang of metalwork resounded from the forges, while the scent of fresh bread drifted from busy bakeries. And always the sound of disciplined marching. Legions moved in perfect unison, shields held high, their polished armor catching the light like a stream of bronze. They advanced along stone roads engineered with such precision that many would endure for centuries. From the mist-covered highlands of Britannia to the sun-scorched deserts of Arabia, Rome's influence reached far and wide. Its eagle standards symbolized both order and authority, commanding respect throughout its vast realm. At its peak, in the 1st century AD, the Roman Empire was a carefully structured system of governance and power. Under leaders such as Augustus, Vespasian, and Trajan, it spanned nearly 5 million square kilometers, encompassing nearly 1/4 of the global population at the time. Sophisticated aqueducts carried fresh water into cities brimming with life, while ornate fountains decorated public squares. A vast network of stone roads connected the empire's heart to its most distant provinces, and for 2 centuries, the Pax Romana Roman peace maintained stability across its core territories. To observers, it seemed as though Rome had mastered the art of enduring prosperity. Yet, this stability came at a cost. It was sustained through careful administration, disciplined governance, and constant movement of resources. Beneath the grandeur, subtle strains had begun to appear, initially small, almost unnoticeable, yet destined to widen over time. The empire's greatest strength, its size, gradually became a challenge. Every newly acquired province required soldiers for defense, governors for oversight, grain for sustenance, and silver for payment. For centuries, Rome's expansion had brought in resources, tribute, and labor that fueled its economy. But after the reign of Trajan, territorial growth slowed. The frontiers became more static, and without large-scale conquests, the flow of new resources diminished. The administrative and military system, designed for continual expansion, began to shift inward. Without the wealth of fresh conquests, greater demands were placed on the empire's own population. Taxes steadily increased, creating economic strain on farmers, artisans, and traders. Many smaller landowners were unable to sustain their livelihoods under these burdens and eventually sold or left their properties. Large estates expanded under the control of wealthier citizens, while the working class often found themselves dependent on these estates for survival. Trade, once the lifeblood of the empire, began to encounter difficulties. Merchant vessels carrying goods from the east faced greater risks, and overland caravans experienced interruptions. Even the once secure roads of Gaul and Hispania grew less reliable. Distant provinces, feeling less connected to the central administration, gradually became less committed to the unity of the empire. In an effort to address financial challenges, the imperial treasury adjusted the composition of its coinage, introducing alloys of less precious metals. While the coins maintained their familiar appearance, their intrinsic value declined. Over time, this led to a loss of confidence in currency and an increase in the cost of essential goods. In rural areas, many citizens turned to influential landowners for protection and stability, offering their labor in exchange for security and sustenance. This arrangement marked the early development of a system that would later evolve into medieval land-based governance. While the economy quietly weakened, political life grew increasingly unstable. In 235 AD, the empire entered a turbulent period known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century. It began with the removal of Emperor Severus Alexander and expanded into decades of political upheaval. In less than 50 years, more than 20 rulers rose to power, many replaced through force or military action. Military legions began supporting their own commanders as leaders, granting authority not through traditional political bodies, but through the influence of armed forces. Internal conflicts diverted the empire's resources away from frontier defense, leaving important borders less secure. The resulting instability tested the resilience of Rome's vast structure and marked the beginning of profound changes to its political and economic systems. The borders groaned under pressure. Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine. Sarmatians swept into Pannonia. Raids grew bolder, and cities once untouched by war were burned and plundered. Worse still, unpaid Roman soldiers began looting their own towns and villas as if they were enemy territory. The historian Zosimus would later write that in these years, Rome consumed itself a beast gnawing at its own limbs. Authority was no longer a duty. It was a prize to be stolen. The great name of Rome, once a promise of law and order, became a banner under which anyone could claim power. By the late 3rd century, even the emperors could see the truth. Rome was too vast for a single hand to control. In 285 AD, Emperor Diocletian made a decision that would change the empire forever. He split it in two. The Tetrarchy was born. 2 senior emperors, called Augusti, and 2 junior emperors, called Caesars, each ruled a section of the empire. The idea was practical. Crises could be dealt with locally, decisions made faster, borders guarded more effectively. But in practice, Rome had ceased to be a single empire. The East, rich with trade, cities like Antioch and Alexandria, and later the new capital of Constantinople, was wealthy and defensible. The West, with shifting capitals in Milan and Ravenna, was poorer, less stable, and vulnerable to constant invasion. The city of Rome itself was still revered, but it was no longer the heart of power. And it was in this weakened Western Empire, plagued by economic collapse and political instability, that a new force began to test Rome's defenses. They were called barbarians, a word the Romans used for all outsiders. But the truth was far more complicated. The so-called barbarians were not a mindless horde. They were nations, tribes, and confederations, each with leaders, traditions, and ambitions. Some sought Rome's destruction, but many sought its protection. They came not always as conquerors, but often as migrants, driven by forces Rome could not yet comprehend. The walls of the empire had not yet fallen, but the first hands were already pressing against them. The year was 376 AD, and the Danube River along the northern boundary of the empire shimmered under a pale autumn sun. On its far banks stood a sea of humanity. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children gathered on the grassy plains, their wagons creaking under the weight of their possessions, their faces hardened by hunger and fear. These were the Goths, a confederation of tribes from beyond Rome's frontier, and they were not here to fight. They were here to beg. For generations, the Goths had been both enemy and ally to Rome. They had raided Roman lands, but they had also served in its armies, traded in its markets, and admired its glittering cities. Now they came as refugees, fleeing a new terror from the east, the Huns. The Huns were unlike any enemy Rome had faced, fierce horsemen from the steppes of Central Asia, moving so quickly that villages vanished in a day. They struck without warning, looted without mercy, and vanished into the horizon. The Goths, unable to withstand their onslaught, had been driven from their homelands like leaves before a storm. When they reached the Danube, they sent envoys to the Roman Emperor Valens in Constantinople, pleading for asylum. "Let us cross the river," they asked. "Give us land within the empire, and in return we will serve as your soldiers, guard your borders, and be loyal subjects of Rome." Valens saw an opportunity. The empire's armies were stretched thin, and here was a chance to gain thousands of warriors in a single stroke. He agreed to their request, ordering Roman officials to ferry the Goths across the river. It should have been a victory for both sides, a moment when Rome absorbed new blood and new strength. Instead, it became a disaster. Roman officials, corrupt and greedy, exploited the desperate refugees. They demanded bribes for food, withheld supplies, and even forced some Goths to sell their children into slavery in exchange for scraps of meat. Resentment grew. Armed skirmishes broke out. What began as a controlled migration turned into an armed uprising. By 378 AD, the Goths were no longer Roman allies. They were Rome's enemies. The two forces met near the city of Adrianople in Thrace. Valens, confident in his legions, refused to wait for reinforcements from the Western Emperor Gratian. On a blistering August day, Roman soldiers marched into battle against the Gothic host. What happened next would shake the empire to its core. The Gothic cavalry, hidden at first, struck like a hammer against the Roman flanks. The legions, trapped under the scorching sun with no room to maneuver, were cut down in their thousands. Emperor Valens himself was killed, his body never recovered. Adrianople was more than a battlefield defeat. It was a psychological wound. For the first time in centuries, a Roman emperor had been slain by foreign enemies in open combat. The myth of Roman invincibility, the idea that no barbarian army could defeat a full Roman field force, was shattered. The Goths did not march on Rome immediately. Instead, they roamed the Balkans, pillaging towns and forcing the empire into uneasy treaties. But their victory opened the floodgates. Other tribes watched closely. If the Goths could carve out a place within the empire, perhaps they could too. The 4th century became an age of movement, not of armies alone, but of entire peoples. Vandals, Alans, Suebi, and Burgundians moved across Europe, some fleeing the Huns, others seeking the wealth and safety of Roman lands. Many entered as foederati allied tribes granted land in exchange for military service. But these alliances were fragile. The Romans often treated their new subjects with suspicion, denying them pay or rights promised in treaties. In turn, the tribes kept their own leaders, languages, and loyalties. They fought for Rome when it suited them, and against it when it did not. Meanwhile, the Western Empire, poorer and more vulnerable than the East, bore the brunt of the pressure. Its tax base was shrinking. Its armies increasingly filled with non-Roman recruits who owed more loyalty to their tribal chieftains than to distant emperors in Ravenna or Milan. In 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, one branch of the Gothic people, marched on Rome itself. The city that had stood for more than 800 years without falling to a foreign enemy now faced siege. The Senate tried diplomacy. Gold and treasure were offered. Promises were made. But years of broken agreements and betrayals had hardened Alaric's resolve. On the night of August 24th, the gates of Rome were opened perhaps by slaves, perhaps by sympathizers. The Visigoths poured in. For 3 days they looted the city. Palaces were stripped, noble houses burned, and treasures carried off. Churches were spared for the most part, but the humiliation was total. The sack of Rome sent shockwaves through the ancient world. St. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, captured the mood. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. And yet even this was not the end. Rome still stood, the empire still existed, but each blow left it weaker. The Vandals crossed into North Africa, seizing the grain fields that fed the Western Empire. The Huns under Attila ravaged Gaul and Italy. The Franks and Burgundians carved out territories of their own. By the mid-5th century, the Western Emperor was little more than a figurehead, his authority limited to whatever land his generals could defend. The Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, still thrived, its walls, trade routes, and wealth giving it centuries more life. But the West was crumbling, its foundations eaten away not by a single catastrophic event, but by decades of economic decline, political chaos, and the relentless pressure of migration and war. The final blow would come not with a grand battle, but with a quiet, almost anticlimactic moment in 476 AD. Odoacer, a Germanic general serving in the Roman army, deposed the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus. No new emperor was appointed in the West. Odoacer ruled Italy in his own name, nominally under the authority of the Eastern emperor, but in reality, as king. The Western Roman Empire as a political entity was gone. And yet, Rome did not truly fall. Its laws, language, religion, and culture lived on in the kingdoms that replaced it. The barbarians did not erase Rome, they transformed it. Many sought to claim its legacy, not destroy it. The Visigoths in Spain, the Franks in Gaul, the Ostrogoths in Italy all considered themselves heirs to Rome's power. The truth was that the empire had not been toppled by a single barbarian invasion, but by a slow, complex process in which outsiders became insiders and Rome itself became something new. When the Western Empire flickered out in 476 AD, the eastern half, often called the Byzantine Empire, did not mourn. From its capital at Constantinople, it looked westward across the Adriatic and saw not the corpse of Rome, but a wounded limb cut away to save the body. Constantinople itself was a marvel, its triple walls, rising above the waters of the Bosphorus, crowned with golden domes and glittering mosaics. Unlike the West, the East was rich, urbanized, and still tied into the trade networks of the Mediterranean and the Silk Road. Spices from India, silk from China, grain from Egypt, and furs from the steppes all flowed into its markets. Its tax system, while not immune to corruption, was functional enough to pay its soldiers and maintain its defenses. Most importantly, the East had learned the lesson the West never mastered. Survival sometimes meant diplomacy over brute force. The Byzantine emperors paid off dangerous enemies, played rival tribes against each other, and recruited mercenaries from the same barbarian peoples who had once overrun the West. Where Rome's old pride had demanded the sword, Constantinople learned to wield the coin and the contract just as effectively. But perhaps the most surprising truth is this: the Eastern Empire did not see itself as something separate from Rome. To them, they were Rome. Their emperor was still Basilius Tun Romaean, emperor of the Romans. Their law was Roman law, their language still the Greek of the eastern provinces, but their identity rooted in the traditions of the Caesars. When Justinian took the throne in 527 AD, he dreamed not of leading a Byzantine empire, but of restoring the Roman Empire to its full glory. And for a time, he almost did. Justinian's generals, Belisarius and Narses, reconquered vast swaths of the lost western territories, North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and parts of Spain from the Visigoths. For a brief, shining moment in the mid-6th century, it seemed as though the old empire might truly be reborn. But history rarely grants second chances. Justinian's wars drained the treasury and spread his armies thin. A devastating plague, the first appearance of the bubonic plague in recorded history, swept through his lands, killing millions and shattering the labor force. The newly reclaimed territories began slipping away as quickly as they had been taken. Still, Constantinople endured for another 1,000 years. While the West plunged into what we call the Middle Ages, the Eastern Empire guarded the accumulated knowledge, culture, and statecraft of antiquity. Its scholars preserved the works of Aristotle and Galen. Its architects built Hagia Sophia, a cathedral so vast and luminous that visitors swore it was not the work of men, but of angels. Its diplomats kept the fragile balance between Christian Europe and the rising power of Islam, navigating centuries of shifting alliances and dangerous wars. Even the barbarians who had taken over the Western lands became, in many ways, Romanized. They adopted Latin as the language of law and governance. They minted coins stamped with imperial imagery. They crowned themselves with titles meant to echo the Caesar's Rex, Imperator, Princeps. The Catholic Church, with the Pope at its head, preserved the Latin liturgy in the memory of Rome's authority, claiming spiritual succession to the empire even as secular power shifted to kings and dukes. In this way, Rome did not vanish, it simply transformed. But if Rome's spirit lived on, Why do we speak of its fall with such finality? Why does the image of a mighty city sacked by wild, unwashed tribes dominate the popular imagination? The answer lies partly in storytelling itself. History is messy, complicated, and full of slow transitions. But human beings crave clear beginnings and endings, simple rises and falls. It is easier and more dramatic to say Rome fell in 476 AD than to explain the centuries of change, adaptation, and survival that followed. And so, in textbooks and popular culture, the empire becomes a single arc, rising from a small city-state to global dominance, then collapsing under the weight of corruption and invasion. The truth that Rome's influence was never truly broken is less tidy, but far more fascinating. Consider this. The legal systems of much of Europe today are still built on the foundations of Roman law. The languages spoken in Spain, France, Italy, Portugal, and Romania are direct descendants of Latin. The architectural principles of Roman engineering arches, domes, aqueducts still define city skylines. Even the very idea of a republic, a senate, and a codified system of rights and citizenship is Rome's gift to the modern world. And then there's the dream, the idea of Rome as an eternal ideal. For centuries after 476, rulers across Europe claimed to be its rightful heirs. Charlemagne, crowned emperor in 800 AD by the Pope, saw himself as reviving the Western Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire, founded in the medieval Germanic lands, wore the name proudly despite being neither Holy Roman nor much of an empire in the ancient sense. Even the Russian czars took their title from Caesar, calling Moscow the Third Rome after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. In truth, Rome never stopped falling and never stopped rising. What ended in 476 was not the world's first superpower, but a chapter in its long, ongoing story. The Western Empire's political structure gave way to a patchwork of kingdoms, but the Roman world's bones remained in law, language, religion, and culture. The Eastern Empire carried its torch for another millennium until it too fell, not to barbarians, but to the cannons of the Ottoman Turks. And even then, Rome's shadow remained, stretching forward into the modern age. So the next time you hear someone say Rome fell, remember, the real story is not one of sudden destruction, but of transformation. Rome did not simply collapse, it evolved, adapted, and survived in ways its founders could never have imagined. Its marble may have crumbled, but its ideas endured. And perhaps that is the truest form of immortality any empire can hope for. If this story of Rome's rise, fall, and hidden survival has changed the way you see history, don't let it end here. Dive deeper into the past. Question the myths you've always believed, and uncover the truths that textbooks leave out. Hit subscribe so you never miss the stories that rewrite what you thought you knew. Leave a like if you believe history is more than just dates and names, and share this with someone who still thinks Rome simply vanished in 476 AD. Because the past is never really gone, and neither is Rome.